Today we're going to try to tackle westward expansion and conflict for approximately the decade after 1800. So we're going through a couple of different presidencies here, but I wanted to try to tell a contiguous story of moving into new areas in the Ohio River Valley. So without further ado, here we go. Take a moment and process these objectives, and we'll be coming back to them at the end. So let's talk about some of the new territories that were set up in the aftermath of Jefferson's election as he continued to aggressively push westward. We sort of skipped over this last time, but it's important to note that Jefferson wanted the United States to be focusing on being a nation of small farmers, exporting crops to Europe, as opposed to a mercantile or industrial nation. And so if you're going to be a nation of small Jeffersonian farmers, you obviously need significant amounts of land in order to continue to repropagate this ideal as the population grows significantly. And so Jefferson helped to lay out all of these territories in the West and appointed people like William Henry Harrison to go about subdividing and getting the quote unquote rights to this land. Obviously, moving into Kentucky and the southern Ohio River Valley have been happening for a while through the Cumberland Gap, but there were other northward routes that was leading to the settlement of the northern Ohio River Valley as well. We started to also see in western New York a series of land purchases being bought from various Native American tribes, legally or somewhat shadily. And we're starting to see Ohio, specifically the Ohio Company, carving up land significantly north of the Greenville Treaty Line and then moving westward into Indiana. This process was, of course, expanded through the Louisiana Purchase, which hopefully you're already aware of. The Louisiana Purchase was about getting access to the Mississippi River because there was some question about our access specifically to the port of New Orleans, which had at this point fallen under French control because complicated stuff in Europe and mostly Napoleon. Napoleon had goals, had this idea that the Louisiana Territory would be a breadbasket for the French sugar colony of Haiti. But after the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon's zeal for overseas adventures waned. And even though Jefferson sent negotiators to just get access to the port of New Orleans, Napoleon ended up selling the entire Louisiana Purchase to Jefferson for a pittance. We're talking pennies on the dollar. And so Jefferson was able to double the size of the country more or less overnight. There's some question as to the legality and constitutionality of all this, especially since Jefferson was a strict constructionist. But in the end, the purchase was popular enough that the agents signed off on it and Jefferson signed off on it even before congressional approval was given. And it was more a fait accompli at that point. There was some criticism of Jefferson for kowtowing to Napoleon and spending a lot of money for westward expansion, mostly from Federalists. But honestly, it was, in the end, most people who weren't just completely self-interested and partisan saw this as a good thing for Jefferson, despite this awesome political cartoon with Jefferson as a prairie dog vomiting up money. So that's exciting to French Minister Talleyrand here. Jefferson also dispatched the Lewis and Clark expedition to chart this new territory. I'm assuming you learned about this in previous history classes, so I'm not going to go into huge amounts of depth into it. The goal of the expedition was to find the headwaters of the Missouri River, but it was but Lewis and Clark went beyond that mandate and went all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which is relevant because it gave the United States a theoretical claim to this territory here, what would be known as Oregon Territory, which was also partially claimed by the Spanish and then maybe also claimed by the British and the Russians. So we have this joint claim to what is eventually going to be Oregon Territory. Lewis and Clark, of course, also met lots of Native American tribes and made connections with them, as well as charting and organizing and doing significant amounts of writing about the native plants and animals of this region. So important as far as geographic expansion and scientific discovery. And this purchase was popular enough that Jefferson easily won a second term. You can see here clearly Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina gets only 8% of the electoral vote, and it's seeming like the Jeffersonian Republicans are dominating national politics, even within the northern states. Aaron Burr falls from power here. He is kicked off the vice presidential ticket because of the whole, trying to steal the presidency thing last round. And so he ends up killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel, which we talked about, because Burr had tried to run for governor of New York and Hamilton blocked him. And so they had a duel and Burr killed Hamilton. He then fled to the West and tried to overthrow or tried to break off part of the Louisiana Purchase and form his own independent country that might be allied with Spain. But it ended up being failed. The plot failed. It was betrayed. He was arrested, but they couldn't find two witnesses. And eventually, Aaron Burr fled for Europe. So that's the end of the story of Aaron Burr. The big story in the second half of Jefferson's term and the first half of James Madison's term is what is the relationship with the natives on the frontier? Because the United States has been aggressively pushing westward, expanding, especially trying to gain, the rights, quote unquote, to this territory. And Native Americans, and this area was relatively heavily populated by Native Americans, especially Native American groups that had been forced out of earlier land purchases in Kentucky and sort of Western Virginia. There wasn't really any one single event that led the Treaty of Greenville to break apart. It was basically just continuous pressure from westward expansion and settlement, and a series of treaties that were signed that kept moving the line further and further westward. So, for example, William Henry Harrison negotiated the Treaty of Fort Wayne with a number of different Native American tribes to open up 3 million acres of land and allow settlers to move into this area. But other Native American leaders, most famously a guy named Tecumseh, who we're going to be talking about momentarily, refused to recognize the treaty. And so the question is, land that's used somewhat jointly by a variety of different tribes, do leaders of one tribe have the right to sell that land? And so this is the modern state of Indiana. And just to sort of show you how this process works, you can see that there are a series of different treaties that over the span of about 50 years slowly opened up more land and forced more Native Americans into smaller and smaller areas as more and more settlers moved in. And eventually, the loudest voice standing against this movement was the chief Tecumseh. Tecumseh was a chief of the Shawnee people, and along with his brother, the prophet Teskawatanawa, I've never been able to pronounce that effectively. These two tried to build a massive native coalition, sort of similar to what Pontiac had put together a generation before, using a combination of Native American anger about westward expansion and Native American folk religion, specifically from his brother, the prophet. So Tecumseh tries to put together this military coalition, and then he was trying to get aid from the British in order to make sure they had the tools to not get overwhelmed by U.S. forces. This leads to quote unquote Tecumsehs War, which was a series of battles between forces loyal to Tecumseh, who was gathering a multinational Native American coalition at a place called Prophetstown, and American forces led by William Henry Harrison, and also, with some help from older chiefs like Little Turtle, who were much more amenable to westward expansion, having been defeated a generation before. There was a series of very contentious meetings between Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison. Here you see them almost coming to blows in one of these attempts to sort of restore the peace and order. And honestly, I don't know that there is a settlement that would have made both sides happy, because William Henry Harrison's goal is to facilitate American westward expansion, and Tecumseh's goal is for Native Americans to still have sovereignty over their land. So I don't know what the middle ground there is. For the Americans, they were very worried that the British were getting involved and were supplying Tecumseh with weapons and supplies and things like that, and were encouraging the Native Americans to kill Americans as a way for the British to both continue to control the fur trade and also slow American westward expansion. And although this was somewhat true, it should be noted that the Native Americans didn't need British coaxing to fight back against American westward expansion, because this was an existential threat to their way of life as well. Eventually, the climatic battle of Tippecanoe broke the power of Tecumseh's federation. Tippecanoe was between forces led by William Henry Harrison, shown here, and the forces led by the prophet, Tecumseh's brother. Tecumseh had been away in the South, trying to negotiate treaties with tribes, with large, powerful Southern tribes like the Cherokee and Creek, when the battle happened. So Harrison was going to basically displace the Native Americans at Prophetstown and seize their supplies. An attack was launched on Harrison's camp by the prophet, who had apparently told his warriors that he had performed a mystical ritual to make them immune to bullets. And so they launched a surprise attack against a larger American force. And shockingly, the magical spell did not work. The Native Americans were not immune to bullets, and their forces were driven back. And then Prophetstown was captured and burned to the ground. It's actually you can actually go visit it. It's in Indiana today. It's a state park, and they have a fantastic lazy river and water and a series of water slides that you can go and ride down and contemplate Tecumseh, the breaking of Tecumseh's Confederation. So, with the Battle of Tippecanoe, Tecumseh's power is broken. He flees northward to try to regain some allies, but westward expansion into the Ohio River Valley is going to continue apace, and it's going to be another generation before Native American forces are again able to mobilize to the point where they can slow westward expansion. So, again, Native power broken, and the Jefferson administration and then the Madison administration after him are going to pursue a policy of assimilation. This is the idea of kill the Indian, save the man, where they're going to push Native Americans to try to adopt more Western customs, intensive agriculture, abandon any sort of swidden farming or hunting and gathering. And they're going to try to trade what they see as, quote, civilization in order to get the natives to live on much smaller tracts of land. So here's the Indian Civilization Program by Jefferson. And this is going to be pursued for about another 30 years until it's replaced by Jackson's policy of removal. So with that, the Native Americans are much less powerful in the Ohio River Valley. And what you end up getting is more or less unfettered westward expansion from the United States. So let's briefly return to our objectives here and make sure you can provide substantive answers to each of these questions. And for tomorrow, we'll talk about growing tension and what eventually led to the War of 1812, which is tied into all of these issues we've been talking about so far.